Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I could tell from the very beginning that it was going to be one of those evenings where my patience would be tested under the flattering light of a restaurant chandelier. The kind of night where everyone talks loudly about nothing and still somehow manages to make you feel like you don't belong in the conversation. The clinking of cutlery, the fake laughter, the predictable questions, it was all so mechanical, like we were acting in a play we'd rehearsed for years. And there I was, sitting across from my mother, watching her face light up as she spoke about Ethan, her precious son, as if the man had personally invented happiness itself. She leaned forward with that syrupy tone she always used when bragging, the one that made every sentence sound like a commercial for her motherhood. "Your brother's party was amazing," she gushed, tapping her glass for emphasis. "He really knows how to bring people together. Everyone said it was the event of the year." Her words filled the table like perfume, sweet, heavy, and impossible to escape. I smiled, because I had learned long ago that silence was easier than argument, that nodding politely caused less damage than trying to remind her that I existed too. But then, as if she had rehearsed it, she looked at me with that innocent expression that always managed to twist the knife just right. "When will you throw yours?" she asked. Her voice had that teasing lilt, the tone that said she didn't expect me to have an answer. I looked at her for a moment, almost amused by how unaware she was of the irony dripping from her words. Then I smiled, the kind of small, slow smile that hides more than it reveals, and said calmly, "Funny, I already did last year. Only difference? You weren't there." Her fork stopped midair. The laughter from the next table seemed to fade into a strange silence around ours. My brother's wife looked down at her plate, pretending to rearrange her food, and Ethan's expression froze somewhere between confusion and guilt. Mom blinked as if I'd spoken in another language. "What do you mean, dear?" she asked, her tone suddenly unsure. I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment, the taste of dry sweetness mixing with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly what I said," I murmured. "You weren't there." For the first time in years, I watched her lose control of her expression. There was confusion, then realization, then that flicker of something she didn't want to admit, guilt, maybe, or fear that she'd missed something important. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. That's when it hit me how powerful absence can be, how silence, when timed right, can say everything you've been choking on for years. I had thrown that party exactly 1 year ago, on a bright Saturday afternoon that should have been perfect. My first real celebration of anything I had achieved. I'd bought my house that month, my first home, modest, but entirely mine. I had cleaned every corner myself, painted the kitchen cabinets, hung fairy lights in the backyard, even baked the cake. It wasn't just a party, it was proof that I could build something without help, that I had made it despite being the family's afterthought. I'd sent invitations to everyone, my mom, my brother, his wife, even a few cousins who rarely texted back. I remember how my hands trembled slightly when I hit send, not because I doubted myself, but because I was foolish enough to think they might actually come. The morning of the party, I woke to a text from Mom. It was short, like everything she sent when she didn't want to sound guilty. "Can't make it, sweetheart. Helping Ethan get ready for his big event tomorrow." I read it 3 times, hoping I'd misread something, but no, it was exactly what it looked like. I put my phone down and stared out the window for a long time, watching the sunlight crawl across the lawn I'd just mowed for the guests that wouldn't arrive. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that she had her reasons, that maybe next time would be different. There's always a next time when you're the kind of person people think will never stop trying. But that day, something inside me began to shift. I still went through with the party, still smiled when a few friends from work arrived carrying bottles of wine and nervous compliments. I served drinks, played music, laughed too loudly at small jokes. But every time someone asked, "Is your family coming?" I felt the words catch in my throat. By the end of the night, when everyone had gone home and the lights were still glowing faintly in the backyard, I sat alone with a half-eaten cake and a mess of paper plates. I remember the silence, thick, heavy, almost physical. That was the night I learned what absence sounds like when it comes from the people who are supposed to show up without being asked. So now, sitting at this table with the same people who had found time for every one of Ethan's milestones, his graduations, his promotions, his wedding, his gender reveal party for a baby that wasn't even born yet, I felt something close to calm. The kind that comes not from forgiveness, but from acceptance. Mom's fork still hadn't moved, her eyes starting between me and Ethan like she was searching for context, for some version of the story where she didn't look like the villain. But there wasn't one. Ethan finally cleared his throat, trying to rescue the moment. "You had a party?" he asked, his voice light but uncomfortable. "You didn't tell us." I laughed softly. "I did. You just weren't listening." And that's the thing about people like them. They never really hear you until the silence gets loud enough to rattle their perfect little world. The rest of the dinner passed in slow motion. The waiter refilled our glasses, the conversation shifted to safer topics, but the tension sat between us like a fourth course no one ordered. Mom tried to smile again, but it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't say another word. There was no point. I had already said everything I needed to say, and the best part was, I hadn't even raised my voice. That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets, I replayed the scene in my head, her frozen expression, Ethan's confusion, the silence that followed. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about acknowledgement, the smallest slice of justice after a lifetime of being overlooked. I didn't know it then, but that dinner was only the beginning. The first small crack in the foundation of a family that had built its comfort on my quiet compliance. And once the cracks start to show, no amount of pretending can cover them up. I remember that morning with an almost embarrassing clarity because I had woken up before the sun like a child on the first day of summer, padding through a house that still smelled like fresh paint and lemon oil, adjusting the string lights I had looped around the back porch, checking the tiny clothespins that held the Polaroid frames in place, refluffing the couch pillows as if a straighter seam could guarantee that the people who were supposed to love me would show up without being begged. And when the first notification from my phone buzzed on the counter, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and smiled before I even looked, only to feel that smile drain out of me the second I read the message in its neat, efficient little sentences that sounded like a calendar reminder pretending to be affection, a message that said she was helping Ethan prepare for his big event and she would not make it to mine, which was such a familiar chord that I could have hummed along to it without thinking. I stood there, watching the sunlight move across the newly mowed lawn like it had somewhere better to be, and I told myself not to cry because nothing kills a celebration like tear tracks on a hostess's face, so I set the phone down, breathed through my nose the way therapists on podcasts tell you to do, and got back to slicing limes as if the right garnish could fix the core memory I was about to create. Guests did come. Not many, but enough to prove that my life was more than a silent family thread, and they arrived with clinking bottles and awkward hugs and that lovely, tentative support people bring when they are not sure how deep your loneliness goes. And I performed the part one knew well, the smiling version of myself who can pour drinks, tease out laughter, and make anything seem easy even when the ease is a lie, because somewhere deep inside I still wanted this day to feel like the beginning of something rather than the inventory list of what had never been given. I showed people the kitchen I had painted by hand, the crooked cabinet door that I fixed with a YouTube tutorial and a blister, the tiny guest room where the light in late afternoon looks like a movie, and every time someone said, "Your family must be so proud," I felt a quick sting that I smothered with a practice joke about how pride in our house comes with a deductible and a 3 to 5 business day delay. By twilight, the backyard looked like a small promise finally kept, warm and human and gently loud. And my friend Mariah handed me a cupcake with a sparkler that spun silver light while I laughed in that open-mouthed way you only laugh when you are determined to prove to yourself that you are not devastated. And when the last guest left with a leftover container and a kiss on the cheek, I stood under the dimming bulbs and listened to a kind of silence that was not empty exactly, more like a room that has been aired out after years of stale air, a silence that contained both hurt and a decision I could feel forming, slow and sane, the way a bruise blooms after impact. I went inside, stacked plates, ran the faucet, and told myself what I already knew, which was that if I kept showing up for people who never arrived for me, I would teach them that my love required no effort from them. And that lesson had been written across too many seasons for me to pretend it was accidental. There is a flavor of humor that only arrives when you are done apologizing for your own presence, and I tasted it later that week when I pulled my photos into a little design app and laid them out into a thin, elegant booklet titled, "With the kind of sweetness that cuts if you touch it too quickly, the people who showed up," and on the first page I placed a single photograph of the porch at dusk with 2 empty chairs, facing the yard like reserved seats in a theater no one bothered to enter. The date stamped in small letters at the bottom, and on the last page I wrote in my smallest, neatest handwriting, "Same address for next time," which was not a plea and not a threat but a statement that knew exactly what it was doing. I ordered 3 copies, because sometimes the kindest message is one that hands people a mirror and does not force them to look, but quietly leaves it where they will eventually catch themselves in it, and when the books arrived in their polite cardboard I slipped them into padded envelopes, addressed one to my mother, one to Ethan and his wife, and one to my aunt who believes everything is a misunderstanding if you just explain it for the rest of your life. I did not include a note, not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because the absence of commentary felt more honest than any paragraph I could craft, and the next afternoon, after dropping the envelopes at the post office and feeling the lightness that comes when a thought moves from your head into the physical world, I drove to a coffee shop where no one knew me and opened my laptop to pull up the invitations I had sent the month before the party, tracing the tidy list of names and the little green check marks from people who had said they would try, and in the corner of the screen a bank alert pulsed with the subdued importance of something that expects to be ignored. I clicked out of habit and saw the lineup of auto payments I had set up over the years as if generosity were a subscription service that could be renewed indefinitely without a conversation, the streaming account that somehow lived at my mother's house, the cloud storage where Ethan keeps baby photos he never backs up, the family phone plan that had drifted to my name the way a leash slips to the hand of the person who walks most often. I stared at that list and felt the same slow, sane decision harden just a little more, the way wet concrete sets into a surface you can stand on, and while the foam on my latte cooled, I scheduled cancellations for the end of the billing cycles, not loudly, not vindicatively, but with the precision of someone who has stopped asking for permission to protect her own oxygen mask first. On the way home my phone buzzed with a shipping confirmation for the photo books and, almost simultaneously, a new subject line slid into my inbox with the bureaucratic blandness of a digital shrug. "Your cosigner statement is available." And I told myself I would look at it when I got inside, even though I already knew that the next chapter of this quiet correction had just introduced itself without a hello. The statement opened like a door I had not realized was hinged to my own front teeth, because the moment I clicked it I tasted that metallic shock that arrives when a truth you have sidestepped for years finally speaks in a clear, administrative voice. And there it was in polite paragraphs and tidy balances, a reminder that a while back, in a season when I still mistook survival for kindness, I had co-signed for Ethan's car because he was between jobs and still liked to tell people that momentum was a personality trait, and I had promised myself it would be temporary, a bridge so short we would barely step on the planks. Yet somehow the bridge had stretched with the seasons until it simply became the road we all pretended had always been there. I sat at my kitchen counter, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator that I had hauled up the driveway with one very patient mover who called me boss, with a grin, and I scrolled through the neat rows of payment history, the occasional late fee tucked into the margins like a coffee ring on a coaster, each one small enough to ignore in the moment and large enough to bruise a mortgage application if it chose to show up at the wrong time, which of course it had. I called the lender and spoke in that careful, unflustered tone I reserve for strangers who guard gates, asking what my options were as a cosigner who wished to step out of the photograph without setting anything on fire, and the representative explained, with the soothing patience of a person who knows they are the bearer of unwelcome structure, that I could not simply vanish, because signatures are not seasons that end when you are tired of the weather, and that removal required a refinance in Ethan's name alone or a formal release based on a streak of on-time payments and a credit score I knew he wore like a suit he forgot to dry clean. I thanked her, because manners are a kind of shield, and I wrote everything down in a notebook that already contained the notes of a woman who has learned that memory, when mixed with disappointment, tends to round off the edges in favor of mercy. If I could not exit the frame with a single gesture, I could at least adjust the lighting, so I began where every invisible contribution lives. In the messy backrooms of autopay portals and family sharing plans and subscriptions that had snuck my card number into their DNA, and I moved with the slow, deliberate calm of someone cleaning a wound, not rushing, not announcing. Simply untying knots that had once felt like intimacy, but now looked more like obligation in a borrowed sweater. I transferred my mother's phone line back into her name with an apologetic chirp to the agent who read me the terms twice. I disabled the extra streaming profiles that had taught a whole branch of the family to believe that movies were a natural resource harvested from my wallet. I removed my card from the cloud storage Ethan used as if the sky itself owed him a backup. And I watched the confirmations arrive like small white flags, not to signal surrender, but to mark a boundary I was late to draw. The first ripple was almost comical because it revealed exactly how much noise true quiet can make, with Ethan texting a breezy question about whether the streaming service was down for everyone or just his living room, and my mother leaving a voicemail in the tone she used for minor emergencies like a missing casserole dish, asking if something had changed with her bill because the customer portal would not accept a password she had never learned. And I answered both with a warmth that did not bend, explaining that I had corrected a few things that had drifted into my name and that everything now matched the reality of who used what, which was the kind of sentence that looks harmless on the page and feels like a closed door when you try the handle. There was a pause, the kind that tells you people are rearranging their story about you in real time, and then a second ripple arrived in the tidy clothes of an automated notice informing me that a late fee had been assessed on the very car note that held my signature hostage, and a third ripple followed, this one human, my brother calling with that laugh he uses when he wants to make consequences sound like a misunderstanding between friends. I listened, because I am not cruel even when I am done being useful for free, and when he finished explaining how the bank is dramatic and how it is hard to juggle everything when you are building your life like a startup, I told him, in one long sentence that felt like a train arriving exactly on time, that the lender had outlined a path to release that required a refinance or a string of punctual months, and that I would be sending a calm, written request with a date by which I expected one of those outcomes to be underway, not because I wished him chaos, but because I intended to stop underwriting a story where my stability is treated like background music. He went quiet in the way people do when they realize that a pattern they love has decided to retire, and he said he would look into it, which is a phrase so elastic it can stretch across a year without breaking. And I said that in the meantime I would be tightening a few other things that should never have been loose in the first place, and I thanked him for understanding even though I suspected he did not. That evening the photo books landed, right on cue, little paper mirrors sliding into the lives I had spent too long adjusting by hand, and while they traveled through the postal system, I drafted the letter to the lender and copied Ethan on it. Each sentence straightforward and courteous, a map with 2 highlighted routes and a gentle but unmovable deadline, and when I finished I felt that clean relief you get when you put something heavy back on the right shelf. I closed the laptop, let the house exhale, and stood at the window watching the porch where last year I had hung lights for people who did not come. And my phone buzzed once on the counter with an unknown number that I almost ignored until I heard my mother's voice through the tiny speaker, soft and thin in a way I rarely hear it, asking if we could all meet for dinner to talk like a family. Which would have sounded sweet once, before I learned that talking often meant I listened while everyone else agreed I was overreacting. And I told her I would check my calendar, because I had indeed begun to schedule my piece like an actual appointment, and when I hung up I knew I had already chosen my answer, and that the next move, quiet and precise, would land exactly where it needed to. The week folded into itself with that strange elasticity you only notice when you are moving through a plan that is both painfully overdue and so cleanly designed that it feels like you are finally treating your own life as something that belongs to you. And I spent those days in small offices and on quiet calls and inside the dull interfaces of customer portals where the real wars of adulthood are waged, telling each system in turn that the era of me underwriting everyone's comfort had ended. Not in a tantrum or a family explosion, but in the kind of administrative clarity that cannot be argued with because it does not ask for anyone's approval. I began with the account I had opened 3 winters ago when Mom's furnace died during a cold snap and I moved money faster than the weather could shift, a tidy emergency cushion. That over time had turned into a silent feed line for every crisis that bloomed in that house without anyone developing the habit of planning beyond next Tuesday. And I walked into the branch with my driver's license and the memory of that snowstorm still lodged behind my sternum. And I closed the account with the steady hand of someone who has realized that generosity cannot be the only language you speak if no one bothers to learn yours in return. While the cashier's checks printed with their crisp new boundaries, I sent a final, courteous note to the lender, attaching the schedule I had already shared with Ethan and outlining in calm sentences the 2 legal paths that would end with my name removed from his obligation. And I copied him not to embarrass him, but because Sunlight is surprisingly efficient at curing excuses that thrive in shadows, and I set a date by which proof of a refinance or a qualifying release needed to land in my inbox, not as a threat, but as the kind of professional courtesy families forget to extend when they assume you will always choose harmony over accuracy. I froze my credit that afternoon because I had finally acknowledged how easy it is for a pattern to propose itself as necessity when the next quick favor lands in the form of a document that only needs your digital signature. And I left the bureau dashboards feeling a kind of private gratitude I usually reserve for good weather during a move. The relief of knowing the door is locked and you were the one who turned the bolt. There were reactions, of course, not loud at first, but they arrived in the knit rhythm of a household adjusting to a reality it had not believed would ever assert itself. With my mother texting a photo of a bill in a tone that tried to sound breezy even as it asked how to log into an account that had never been hers, and my aunt calling to say that the little photo book was tasteful but pointed, in a way that made her uncomfortable, which I accepted as a rare compliment, and Ethan leaving me a voice message where he performed the delicate art of seeming both amused and slightly wounded, as if a late fee were a practical joke I had failed to laugh at, and I let all of it sit while I drafted one more piece of quiet architecture. A single-page ledger that listed, without commentary or adjectives, the expenses I had shouldered for the past few years along with dates and amounts and the phrase gift or loan next to each line, because narrative bends under pressure, but arithmetic does not. I sent the ledger to the family group thread without an accompanying speech, and then, in a separate email to Ethan, I attached a simple repayment plan for the few items that were indeed loans, stretched over months in amounts he could manage if he chose to manage anything at all, and I signed it with "Love, your sister," because what I wanted wasn't a courtroom victory but a cultural shift, and sometimes the softest signature carries the sharpest point. The next signal arrived from the bank in the language I had been waiting for, an automated alert that a payment due had not been received, followed by a human email reminding the cosigner that delinquency would trigger contact. And I let the system do what it was built to do while I did what I had finally learned to do, which was refuse to soak up the spill before the person holding the cup noticed their own hand. And I forwarded the notice to Ethan with 2 sentences that were kind but square, reminding him of the refinance timeline and the release criteria and adding that I would not cure any default now or later, because curing it would simply resurrect the old belief that my stability was a service rather than a person. He replied with a paragraph that moved like a carousel through explanations, and I did not argue with it because arguments are invitations to rehearse the same play with different costumes, so I answered with a single line and the link to the lender's application page, then turned off my phone and took a long walk around my neighborhood, where the late sunlight turned every window into an honest mirror. By the time I returned, the photo books had found their destinations like small, polite messengers that refused to embellish their news, and my aunt had written again, this time privately. Not to scold, but to confess that she kept turning to the page with the 2 empty chairs because something about the angle of the light made her feel implicated, and I sat with that acknowledgement the way you sit with a cup that is finally warm in your hands. And I allowed myself one long exhale before opening The latest message from my mother, a carefully composed invitation to dinner that proposed a neutral restaurant and promised an open conversation, which would once have sounded like a chance to negotiate my feelings down to fit inside the family's decorative bowl, but now read like a summons to a place I had already visited in episode 1 of my own awakening. I accepted with a brief reply that set the time and confirmed I would pay only for myself, and I closed my laptop as another notification slipped onto the screen, this one from the lender again, stating in tidy sentences that if the account remained unpaid through the grace period, they would escalate contact with all responsible parties, and I smiled. Not because I enjoyed anyone's discomfort, but because levers do not work until you let them touch the thing that needs moving. That night, I packed the final piece of my quiet revenge into a simple envelope, a small flash drive labeled with the date of my housewarming and the title, "For Your Records," which contained every photo and video from that day and a single document with login instructions for the shared family folder I had created and then archived, so that no one could claim I had erased history when all I had done was return it to the people who had ignored it, and I placed the envelope beside my keys so I would not forget to bring it to dinner like a hostess gift with a very specific guest in mind. As I turned off the porch light, I heard my phone vibrate across the kitchen counter with 2 stacked messages, one from Ethan that read, in a tone that tried too hard to be casual, "Let's talk before dinner, we can sort this out," and one from my mother, for words that always arrive too late to be useful, "Please don't make a scene," and I laughed, not cruelly, but in the weary, relieved way people laugh when the road finally stops pretending to be a circle, and I whispered to the empty room that I would not make a scene because the scene had already been made for years, and tomorrow I would simply stop playing my part. The restaurant looked different the second time, not because the lamps glowed any brighter or the banquettes had learned a new trick, but because I walked in with a small envelope in my bag and a steadiness in my spine that made the air feel less crowded. And when I saw my mother already seated with Ethan and his wife, both of them wearing that careful expression people save for funerals and negotiations, I realized that whatever story they had rehearsed on the drive over was about to meet the version of me that no longer accepted roles handed out at the table. The server poured water with theatrical politeness, menus open like shields, and for a few minutes we pretended that appetizers could buy us time, that a basket of warm bread could soften a year of missed calls and automatic withdrawals. Yet under the silverware and soft chatter there was that other conversation thrumming, the one we had finally run out of room to avoid, which is how these things always begin, with small talk that quickly realizes its own uselessness and lies down. Mom started with the line she must have practiced, a paragraph about misunderstanding and busy seasons, and how family is a team if everyone remembers the playbook. And I let her finish, because I have learned that cutting someone off only convinces them that their unfinished sentence contains a solution. Then I told her, in a single breath that held a dozen steady clauses, that I was done funding the version of us where my effort keeps the lights on while everyone else talks about how bright we are, and that I would not resume any payments, not this month or any month after, because what had looked like kindness had long ago become a habit that kept all of us lazy in different ways. She blinked with that mix of pride and irritation particular to mothers who believe endurance is affection, and she said she wished I had told her sooner, which was a sentence so familiar it might as well be a family heirloom. So I answered that I had told her in every possible dialect including silence, and that the problem had never been my volume but her choice not to listen unless the listening came wrapped in glitter. Ethan shifted into his explanation, a polished string of reasons about timing and accounts and how the lender's emails were dramatic, and I listened without interrupting because it is easier to stand your ground when you let the weather pass. And when he reached the part where he suggested I spot him one last grace period in the spirit of togetherness, I slid the envelope onto the linen and watched his eyes before he touched it, because faces always speak before fingers do. Inside the envelope lay the little flash drive labeled with the date of my party and the words, "For Your Records," along with a copy of the lender letter and the step-by-step instructions for a refinance that even a distracted optimist could follow. And as he turned the drive over like a found coin, I said that I had brought him the exact road he needed, and that if he took it I would cheer for him from a distance, and if he refused I would not catch him at the bend, because I had already spent too many seasons standing below the hill with a net. My mother picked up her fork and set it down again, not eating, not speaking, weighing whether to appeal to my heart or to the history that had, until recently, made me a predictable resource. And I decided to save her the trouble by making the smallest reveal I had kept for this exact moment, a reveal that was not a threat, not a performance, merely an architectural fact about my life that they would need to know if we were to stop scraping each other on the same corners. I told them I had placed my house and accounts into a simple living trust with a single condition that protected me from emergency requests disguised as lightning bolts, and that any future loans or co-signatures were legally impossible without a trustee's approval that would not materialize, not because I wished anyone harm, but because the person who keeps rescuing the group eventually drowns while everyone writes a eulogy about how reliable she was. The words were not loud, yet they carried, and I heard the room recalibrate as if someone had finally set the table to match the number of chairs. Ethan muttered that this all felt extreme, which made me smile in a way that was not unkind, because what feels extreme to the person losing access often feels like oxygen to the person who has been holding their breath for years. And I said that extremes are measured from the center, and that for once I had found mine. Mom's eyes went shiny the way summer glass does when a storm is waiting behind it, and she reached across the cloth as if to touch my wrist, then stopped, fingers hovering, and asked whether there was any room for a reset. Any path where we all owned our part and moved forward without tallying old wounds like lawyers. I told her there was always a path because I was not building a wall, I was building a gate, and gates can open if the person on the other side remembers to knock, and she asked what knocking looked like. And I said it looked like Ethan emailing the lender's confirmation number by the date in my letter, and it looked like her paying her own bill without turning it into a morality play, and it looked like everyone learning the simple choreography of showing up on time and not expecting applause. The server arrived unhelpfully with the entrees, the plates fragrant and hot, which made the timing of my final gesture almost cinematic in a way that embarrassed me even as it felt earned, and I reached into my bag for the last item I had brought, a small, square book with a photograph of 2 empty chairs facing a string of lights, and I laid it beside my mother's glass, not as a weapon but as a record, and I said that this was the party she had asked me about at the first dinner, the night. She praised Ethan like a festival and wondered when I would celebrate my life, and that the answer had always been the same, which is that I did, and she simply did not come. Her fork rose and stayed in the air as if it had forgotten its purpose, and for a moment the table held 4 different truths breathing at once, none of them wrong, all of them inconvenient. And the only sound was the soft clink of ice settling in a glass that had been left alone too long. When the check came I paid for my meal and nothing more, not because I wanted to score a point, but because I needed the muscle memory of drawing the line to be as ordinary as passing the salt, and I stood with a calm that felt almost new. Told them I would wait for the lender confirmation, kissed my mother on the cheek in a gesture that held neither surrender nor distance, and walked out into a night that refused to decide whether it was warm or cool, which seemed appropriate for an ending. That might not be an ending at all. At home the porch light welcomed me with the same steady patience it had offered on the night of my party, and my phone buzzed with 2 messages, one from Ethan that contained a screenshot of the refinance application, and one from Mom that read, simply. I looked at the book, and although I typed an answer twice I deleted both and set the phone face down, because sometimes the most honest reply is to let the next sentence arrive from someone else, and to give it the quiet it needs to prove it means what it says.